We Got the Beat on Game Boy Works episode 114. Going forward, Game Boy Works will be taking a page from Game Boy Works Color. Each episode will focus on one American or European release, backed with a Japan-only title. This should double the speed at which I can cover the system's extensive library. And who knows, maybe I can actually complete the series before the human species is wiped to extinction by our own stupidity. This episode's American release is, ironically, a game I first became aware of through its Japanese version. Back in the waning days of Game Boy, post-N64 launch but pre-Pokemon Red and Blue US release, the system occupied a strange place in the American retail market. Game Boy still sold well enough to continue being supported, but with retail releases drying up and interest from core gamers effectively being non-existent, it was pretty much anything goes with Game Boy. That meant sometimes you'd find strange things like Japanese releases mixed in with the rest of the games on a shelf at, say, a Waldensoft in West Texas, as happened with me with Go-Go Tank. The game has always stuck with me since this bizarre and inexplicable encounter, a good 7 years or so after the game's original Japanese release under the same title. Who knows how or why a few copies of the Japanese edition of Go-Go Tank ended up at my local game shop, but in the end, it didn't really make much difference. Go-Go Tank has no language barrier to speak of, with practically zero in-game text and play mechanics that anyone can sort out in very little time. It's a game about leading a tiny tank to a goal in an indirect way. Online reference sources like Wikipedia refer to Go-Go Tank as a strategy game, which is it's pretty weird, honestly. This is a straight-up action puzzle game. And despite the proliferation of that particular genre on Game Boy, it's actually an example of the form that stands out from the average. Go-Go Tank is cast from the same mold as something like Lemmings or Mario and Wario, although it predates both. It's a puzzle-oriented escort mission, which tasks you with the grim duty of leading said tiny tank to its objective despite having no direct control over it. The tank in question roams around mindlessly on the field, puttering about in a straight line and occasionally firing off cute little bullets. The tank can climb over low barriers, but not tall ones, and it advances until it encounters an insurmountable obstacle. When the tank hits a wall, it takes a bit of damage and turns in the other direction. Your goal then is to create passable pathways for the tank to use to reach its goal before it smashes itself into oblivion and explodes. Other hazards exist on the field, including dangerous pits and hostile gun emplacements. The tank isn't totally defenseless, but its driver is not the sharpest knife in the weapons locker, so it's really incumbent upon the player to keep the poor dumb things safe. To this end, your plane is equipped with the ability to stage very limited and largely ineffectual air-to-ground attacks with a small bomb. These drop from your plane in a limp arc and detonate on contact with no real splash effect to speak of, so you need to be precise in your attacks, all while doing your best to be a good shepherd to your ground-bound charge. It's a fairly simple premise without an enormous number of factors to deal with, but Go-Go Tank ain't easy. The challenge here arises from the fact that your plane is a hassle to control. Your plane is basically the opposite of Mario when he swims. You know you have to pump the A button to make Mario swim because he sinks otherwise? Here, your plane constantly rises to the top of the screen, forcing you to nudge it downward repeatedly in order to maintain the altitude you want. This makes lining up your skyhook with blocks or landing precise bomb hits pretty challenging. You can't really fly level here, so the most essential skill in your toolbox turns out to be the power to predict and control the downward dips of your plane as you struggle to steer it. This is not the most enjoyable play mechanic I've ever come across, and it's made even more frustrating by the fact that you can't take other actions while turning your plane. While Go-Go Tank's challenges might feel fairly reasonable if you could drop bombs or release crates while performing tight maneuvers, that simply isn't possible. Plus, the addition of weird power-ups, like a duplicate plane that messes up your careful stair-step arrangements, along with the fact that you can accidentally destroy crates by dropping them in the wrong place, means that you can enter an unwinnable state even if you use the built-in infinite health cheat code. Game Boy certainly didn't want for puzzle action games. There are much better examples to be found on the system. This is a vexing, though admittedly interesting, early take on the escort mission genre that would explode into the mainstream and the top of the charts just a few months later thanks to DMA Design's challenging, but not in an unreasonable way, hit Lemmings. This game comes to us from some familiar faces: Toei Animation, Copia Systems, and Electrobrain in the US. Like every other Copia Systems game we've seen, Go-Go Tank seems to mean well, but it's too annoying to play to properly live up to those ambitions. It is the hangover of the 80s, and there is time for Dragon Quest clones. By 1990, Japan's Dragon Quest craze showed no signs of abating, and why should it? Early in the year, Chunsoft and Enix had turned the format inside out with the madly ambitious Dragon Quest IV, which turned the humble role-playing game into a sort of fantasy anthology cycle. We've seen a few Dragon Quest-inspired RPGs on Game Boy Works already, from the brilliant Final Fantasy Legend to the insipid LACROAN Heroes. And one of the system's finest works, Final Fantasy Legend II, lurks on the horizon here. Before we can get there, though, we need to survive this week's take on the genre, the largely unremarkable Aretha. From what I can tell, Aretha was the very first project created by both Japan Art Media and Yanoman, a pair of companies that would stick around for a couple of decades yet never penetrate the American market. Yanoman was primarily a toy and board game company who we recently saw attached to Hexite for Game Boy Color. How they became involved in a Dragon Quest derivative is anyone's guess, though everyone in Japan wanted to be on that money train in the late 80s would be a good place to begin that guesswork. Japan Art Media, on the other hand, appears to be one of those unremarkable developers of the era, with no hits to its name and no significant connection to people from more successful studios. Aretha might be the closest thing Jam ever experienced to a breadwinner, having evidently done well enough to see several sequels and even some Game Arts co-developed remakes for Super Famicom. The bubble economy, it seems, was a tide that lifted all ships, no matter how unworthy. On its surface, Aretha seems innocuous enough. It's a mishmash of things that sold well in late 80s Japan. Not only is it a turn-based RPG, it also features a cute eponymous heroine who appears to be about 16 years old and wears revealing bikini armor. Is the game's title being so similar to Athena a mere coincidence? One wonders. In any case, this does have at least a spiritual connection to SNK's Athena, in that it's kind of mundane and ultimately very flawed. Aretha doesn't seem too janky at the outset. It's a very straightforward turn-based RPG with towns and random encounters and shops. You buy equipment, grind for experience and gold by fighting monsters, scour villages for clues and guidance, and advance to the next area of the game once you're strong enough. All fairly basic, right? But in reading further about this game, thanks to an in-depth overview on Hardcore Gaming 101, its flaws have become more evident and more remarkable. Aretha attempts to innovate in the role-playing genre by introducing an element designed to reduce the tedium of battling through low-level enemies. Once your party's stats and levels are sufficiently advanced beyond a certain threshold, random encounters stop appearing in the current area of the world. This is perhaps reminiscent of EARTHBOUND's auto-victory feature, where lower-level enemies attempt to flee from Ness and company, and bumping into their sprite on the dungeon map results in instant victory. It doesn't work out quite as smoothly here, probably because Aretha belongs to the invisible enemy school of encounter design, rather than letting you see your foes as you dungeon dive. After a certain point, random encounters simply stop, which means your experience and gold earnings do as well. There's a finite amount of cash that can be earned in Aretha, and certain key items need to be purchased in order to complete the game, meaning it's entirely possible to screw yourself into an impossible-to-complete scenario by spending wantonly along the way. These are some strange design choices that suggest either a lack of time to playtest the actual outcomes of Jam's clever ideas, or else a lack of care for the end-user experience. Whatever the case, Aretha was released just a couple of weeks before what was arguably Game Boy's finest pre-Pokemon RPG moment. Since the Game Boy entries in the Aretha trilogy have never been fan-translated into English, there's not really much reason to try to grapple with this one. Not when Final Fantasy Legend II is right around the corner. Next time on Game Boy Works, we're battling, and that's no bull.